Hello, and welcome to Group 4's proposed governance for Cosadag Fisheries. Our stakeholder is Khan Sat, a key economic actor on Cosadag who owns a large swathe of land, including an ice factory, a hotel, and several shops. He is primarily interested in improving the lives of his family and his wider community, and has displayed a distrust of the CFI and its current setup due to his belief that they are limiting fishing opportunities, of which he is a key investor in.
The two main challenges of creating governance for Cosadag were the corruption and mistrust within the Cambodian government and typical common pool resource challenges such as the lack of trusted actors and a lack of incentives to cooperate. To overcome these challenges, we decided that any governance in Cosadag must be self-governing, have a high level of community participation, and be an accountable and transparent community. We therefore decided that with these modifications, the community facing organisation could be all of these things.
So our approach to governance is through decentralisation. Cosadag has never had the government resources to hold rule breakers responsible. Decentralisation of power to the CFI will allow a more proactive approach and enable appropriate sanctions to be made. The CFI can be used for policy deliberation and adaptation, along with coordination of fishing and enforcement. Our recommended approach to governance would be adaptive, meaning that policies can be evolved to suit changing data and circumstances. It would also be democratic, meaning that all residents of Cosadag are represented. The governance would be nested so the authority would be embedded at a local level, and it would be fair, meaning that the same rules and consequences are for everyone. So decentralisation is the transfer of powers from central authorities to a lower level of management. Although this involves political and economic processes, this transfer does not mean that central governance is weakened, especially as the process must have sufficient support from the central authority. This process can involve NGOs, communities, and the local governments. So, types of decentralisation. There's democratic decentralisation, which is a top-down progression of powers to lower levels of management and local governance. This allows a gradual opening of spaces for input to management from lower levels of authority. Deconcentration is the transfer to branch offices outside the capital from central authorities. And devolution is a form of decentralisation that allows a wider set of possibilities for the transfer of powers. For example, this may be the transfer from central authorities to a local community. And reasons for decentralising governments. So theoretically, decentralisation of governance should improve local resource management and allocation, and alongside advancements in overall efficiency of local resource usage. As local communities have more knowledge of local processes, it will make governance more specific, accountable, and responsive, whilst also improving local management.
So our overall approach to enforcement is a community self-enforcement strategy. Keane et al. In 2008 argued that successful conservation needs rule-breaking behaviour to be discouraged amongst resource users through strong enforcement. Our approach therefore aims to achieve this. We propose that sanctions in the form of fines are imposed on rule breakers, as fines are a recognised form of sanction that has been used across the world, and graduated sanctions is one of Elinor Ostrom's principles for successful conservation. Where our approach differs is that the money from fines will be distributed amongst the fishers who are members of the CFI, with 50% of the fine money given to the fisher who reports the wrongdoing. This basically turns all the fishers into free enforcement officers who are motivated to report rule breaking for their own financial benefit. This helps to minimise costs of enforcement while increasing the probability of detection significantly due to the high number of people involved in enforcement. This fits with Ehrlich's 1996 recommendation that effective enforcement should seek to minimise monitoring and enforcement costs while simultaneously maximising probability of detection, and that the probability of detection may even be more influential than severity of punishment. We propose that any conflicts be taken to the CFI where they can be resolved internally amongst the members. No. This is a good governance table that illustrates how our approach is in line with the good governance principles in terms of transparency, participation, accountability, coordination and capacity for actors, rules and practice. Next.
So from our government principles, we have developed various rules to govern the fisheries of COSADA. They centre around developing a fishing licence, protecting species habitat, closing areas with low fish stock, and a form of taxation. Next slide, please. So our first proposed rule involves the establishment of a licensing system, which will ensure the biodiversity of the sea and improve future food security. So with the establishment of a marine protected area in COSADA, we thought it was an ideal time to create a licensing system with only those who are licensed being able to fish in a certain area. So this will not limit the fishing opportunity of locals, but will make it harder for illegal trawlers to fish. So to obtain a licence, fishers must increase their net mess sizes to prevent bycatch of young fish before they can breed, therefore allowing them to spawn a new generation. This will also hopefully prevent seahorses from being caught by fishers, thus improving the aesthetic value of the coral reefs and improving tourism. So we also wanted fishers to report their catch statistics to CFI, which would allow them to monitor fish population sizes and occurrences and to develop policy which would improve where people can fish. Fishers would also have to not use any destructive fishing practices, which could include bottom trawling, blast fishing, mirami, and cyanide fishing. So whilst there is current legislation covering destructive fishing practices, this is really enforced. So by decentralising the power of the CFI and promoting community enforcement, we believe that destructive fishing practices will decrease in occurrence on COSADA. So if anyone is found to be in breach of these rules, then sanctions can be imposed. These sanctions will be graduated, with first offences receiving a fine and later offences becoming more severe, eventually resulting in removal of licence. So to complement this licensing system, we also wanted to improve education around biodiversity and explain to fishermen and the community why it's important these rules are carried out. Because if the fishers understand these rules and how it will benefit them and their children in the future, they're more likely to comply. So with regards to fish vaccination, the only part of the licensing system which can really be implemented easily is the reporting of catch statistics. So this can be achieved by writing the catch on the whiteboard after each turn, or perhaps putting it on Moodle. Then to simulate community enforcement, members of the class can report other teams for not giving these statistics or providing incorrect statistics.
Our second strategy involves placing fishing restrictions on parts of the most vulnerable habitats in coastal areas of COSADA. By ensuring that habitat and breeding grounds of fish remain suitable, we can ensure the survival of a variety of marine species. This could help to alleviate problems of overfishing, biodiversity loss, and damage to important fish breeding grounds. The three habitats that would be considered for protection would be corals, areas of seagrass, and mangroves. These areas are particularly important to preserve in COSADA because of their high biodiversity and as breeding grounds for valuable fish species. These protections would also include bans on damaging bottom trawling in these protected areas and regulations around land development that require developers to prove that their development plans would not harm these habitats. As our stakeholder, CARNSAT, is averse to placing limits on fishing rights, we would ensure that these protected areas only cover the most vulnerable sections of these habitats and not the whole areas. These protections would aim to maintain or even increase fish stocks through the protection of fish nursery grounds, which could encourage spillover of mature fish into other areas. This, we hope, would alleviate CARNSAT's concerns about imposing limits on fishing. We would also set up a permit lottery for some fishers to occasionally fish in these areas for prized species such as shrimp. The permit lottery would be combined with smart monitoring, perhaps in partnership with NGOs, to monitor biomass levels in order to award an appropriate number of permits. In order to increase compliance with protections for habitats, we would hold education sessions with fishers. These protected areas would be enforced with our approach of community self-enforcement and graduated sanctions. Next. Our third strategy involves closing certain areas for fishing where fish stocks are becoming dangerously low for certain periods of time. Data will be provided by a smart monitoring system in partnerships with NGOs and scientists. This aims to help alleviate the problem of overfishing by reducing the pressure on overfished species temporarily to allow stocks to recover before fishing is resumed. This would help to prevent the collapse of fish stocks, which would benefit both the ecosystem and the fishers who depend on healthy stock levels. Because of the use of smart monitoring, the areas can be closed based on real-time data, allowing for the minimisation of closure time and more effective control of stock levels. These temporary area closures would be enforced using our community self-enforcement approach with graduated sanctions. We think this strategy would be appropriate for COSADAC, because it could work better than permanent protected areas, as it would enable for the continuation of fishing at all times, at least in some areas, which our stakeholder CANSAT supports, and because it would help to maintain healthy fish stock levels for long-term security of fishing livelihoods. Next.
Our final rule is an aspirational rule set on introducing a lump sum taxation of shipping vessels' insurance value in COSADAC. Its nature as a top-down CPR management scheme relies on greatly improved institutional capacity of the Cambodian government on COSADAC and is thus set on a 15-year time. This divergent method away from earlier rules is adopted due to the realization of CPR scholars such as Ostrom and Jensen, who say that effective and trusted CPR institutions, intrinsically integrated into the political and administrative arrangements of any given area, are vital to sustainably manage CPR resources and navigate complex social ecological issues. These institutions can provide legal basis against powerful external forces such as illegal Chinese fishing vessels in COSADAC. They can also transform the behavior of policy target groups such as CANSAT through their coherent policy goals and through the use of nudge theory. On COSADAC, this could be giving greater information to fishermen like COSADAC to develop choice architecture to slightly alter personal beliefs in order to avoid overfishing and stress the importance of leaving fish stocks for future generations. In the EU, these top-down schemes have included command and control regulation, whereby the government defines the aggregated capacity permitted in each fishery through the controlling of certain inputs such as gross tonnage or engine power in kilowatts. Decommissioning grants are also used in the EU to offer incentives for fisheries to give up boats and thus avoid overutilization of fish stocks. However, neither of these top-down schemes address the fundamental economic incentives that drive overutilization. Thus, embracing the moral philosophy of scholars such as Derek Parfit, who believes that the lives of the unborn and of future generations should be strongly considered in government policy, we propose a lump sum taxation of shipping vessel insurance values to address overutilization of fish stocks. This would be achieved because at a certain point, the size of the shipping vessel size will not lead to greater returns to the individual economic actor, and thus we can sustainably manage fish resources for future generations. So here's a brief summary of the implementation of rules into the fish bank simulation. Our first rule is everyone must give each catch statistics to the group after each round. Failure to do so will result in sanctions. Our second rule is a limit on the number of ships in the coast area to represent fishing limits imposed by protected regions within the real-life coastal area of COSADAC. The price signal is that money will be taken away if these rules are broken, with increased graduated sanctions for each time a rule is broken by each group. Our third rule is in fish banks, if one fishing area is closed, only 50% of boat capacity is allowed to be used in the other area in order to prevent overfishing in that area. These closures will last a single round to reflect their temporary nature. Our final rule is each fishing vessel is taxed at 10% each year at the vessel's buying price. Enforcement. To represent community self-enforcement, all teams are allowed to see where other teams have placed their boats. And for our exclusion, limits on the number of ships in the coastal fishing area with a maximum of 2 ships per team. Thank you.